I don't know what your experience is with habits. Maybe you've got great habits, maybe you've got terrible habits, maybe they're strong, maybe they're not. But as you reflect a little bit on your habits and the role of habits in your life, take a moment to consider that habits are like muscles. And like muscles, you can develop them by using them over time in different ways, in different conditions. So sometimes we don't think too much about habit development, just as sometimes we don't think too much about muscular development. And sometimes that's okay. Sometimes we can get away with it because our muscles are suitably developed. And likewise, sometimes our habits are suitably developed. And if the types of things you want to do with yourself, you have sufficient muscle tone for, arguably that's okay. You don't really need to worry about the muscular development that much. You know, you notice this. I remember a while back ago, I hadn't cycled in a while, and I got one of those Dublin bikes, which is the bike hire bikes that you can just, borrow them by the hour. And I cycled. And I recognized that there were muscles that I didn't know that I didn't have, if that makes sense. So it's not so much that it was like, oh yeah, I could improve that. I was like, I didn't even know I had those muscles. And what was particularly interesting about it is, it's not that I was necessarily completely unfit. I certainly wasn't completely fit, but I wasn't completely unfit. I'd been doing fairly vigorous physical work over the past while, lifting things and doing a bit of building work. So it was quite active, and it was over a prolonged period of time. But they were just different muscles. And I think something similar is true of habits, that sometimes we just don't notice that we haven't got certain habits until maybe we start to do something different. And habits can exist in many different directions. In the social world, the ways we communicate with people, the ways we even deal with challenges. If you work in customer service, you get your strategies down. What's the right thing to say? What's the wrong thing to say? You've got habits or patterns around that, and you learn through trial and error to some extent what's useful. Now, sometimes we don't learn. Sometimes we just get stuck for various reasons to what we're used to. Maybe we, again, don't even know we're doing it. We don't even know it's something that can be shifted. Sometimes the problem is the habit works, but it works enough, so we don't really improve it. So the example is somebody who lifts, and they lift but in a non-optimal way. So they're holding in a box in a way that allows them to keep the box held, so it's not terrible as a strategy, but nor is it perfectly balanced so it feels easy and it feels comfortable. You see this with backpacks. Where is the weight distributed? A poorly designed backpack, or one that isn't properly adjusted, can be much, much apparently heavier than exactly the same load, but when it's well adjusted. Things like baby carriers are a really good example of this. They can work miracles if you have the child properly optimized, and the difference between that and trying to carry the child can be really, really huge. So habits can be useful to consider to be very similar to muscle tone in that way. So that leads to the question, what kind of habits have you got in your life? Are they working for you, or are they not? And even if they are working for you, can they be improved? Can they be developed? So one of the key things when it comes to practicing or developing a new habit is clarifying what the habit is that you want and practicing it. So just like muscle tone, you're going to say, well, what muscles do I want to develop? And that question in turn is part of the bigger question of, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to cycle? Are you trying to run? Are you trying to lift boxes? And if so, in what position, in what angle, in what way? So you can work backwards to some extent when you know the areas that you want to improve on. And you can start to then question, what is a good way of doing that? And you can experiment to some degree with it. So if you're doing that, you're already in a great place. You're clarifying what you want and you're practicing it. That is the equivalent of developing that muscle tone, and it's going to develop in that way. Now, the question that is often asked then is, how long does it take to develop a new habit? Now, that's a rather sophisticated question. In a sense, the quick answer is, it doesn't matter. If the habit is worthwhile enough, start practicing it and you'll figure that out. It's like, how long does a journey take? If it's somewhere you need to get to, It actually doesn't matter how long it takes, whether it takes a year or a day. If you need to get there, just get going and move in that direction and learn from it. But one of the things they recommend when it comes to habit formation is allowing some time to pass by. And of course, like the physio example, like the movement example of muscles, clearly we need a certain amount of time because we need to stretch the muscles and then rest them. Stretch them and then rest them, and typically move in kind of small incremental steps rather than doing too much too soon. So sometimes with habits that can be the same, although not necessarily. It doesn't necessarily need to be that you break down a habit into tiny steps as you would with muscular development. Sometimes you can actually embrace the whole habit from day one, but at the same time you may need to keep some of the old habits at least for a little while, just to sort of tide you over. If you have bad habits in inverted commas, maybe you watch a bit of TV in the evening to help relax and you want to switch to another form of relaxation. If you take away all that TV time suddenly, it's not that you can't do that, that sometimes might work, but sometimes a better strategy is to leave the old habits in place, but just bring in other ones alongside them. Maybe watch a little less TV, but do something else that's more active as well, or a bit of reading or something else, and transition over in that way. So whatever works, a bit of experimentation here is normally useful. So you've clarified what the habit is and you're practicing it. But one of the other advantages is not just having enough time go by so that your system has time to adjust to it, but one of the things time typically gives you, not always, but typically, is just a range of different experiences as feedback, a range of different results, and a range of different contexts. And what I mean by that is, if you, in a given day, if you practice something and it went well for you, okay, good. However, if you were to practice that same behavior the next day, there may be a different set of circumstances. So you might be much busier in work, let's say, the next day. So it's actually much harder to practice that new habit then on that second day. Then on the third day, you go to practice that habit, and it might be a very good day again. So it's actually rather easy for you. And then you get good feedback. You feel good doing it. So you're more committed for the next day, which is just as well, because then maybe on the fourth day, all hell breaks loose. And, there's 3 unexpected things you've got to deal with that day. And what tends to happen, it depends a little bit on the habits, but what tends to happen is when you're under pressure, a lot of the time we revert back to what we know best. Even if it's not the perfect strategy, and even if we kind of know that, still we'd rather go with what we know. There's a sense of a safety in it. So having a period of time go by where you're committed to practicing developing habits is rather useful, because what that will give you is, again, time to make sure that there's a fit, and maybe you are taking it in steps or stages. But it'll also give you a range of different circumstances and challenges which can be helpful. So sometimes you'll hear people recommend a month as a period of time. Again, it depends massively. There are a variety of different habits, but something like a month can be a good starting point. I think that it's a reasonable period of time where you say, okay, probably over the next month, I'm going to have a good range of experiences which can be helpful. But at the same time, you're never going to have all experiences in any period of time, whether it's a month or 3 months. A good seasonal consideration is weather. So a lot of the time with fitness and health goals, this happens. You happily decide, okay, I'm going to get up early in the morning, I'm going to exercise, I'm going to do whatever I'm going to do. So no problem, that's a good goal. It may take a little bit of effort, but you set that goal in summer, great, no problem. All of a sudden winter comes along, let's say it's 6 months later, and that exact same goal, even though you have technically developed muscle tone, all of a sudden it's as if that box is now heavier to lift. Because now when you open your eyes, instead of the birds singing outside and the sun shining in, now it's like something out of an Edgar Allan Poe poem outside, and there's thunder and there's rain, and it's scary. And you're like, what? I want to get up into the icy cold, and I want to have a shower, I want to exercise. No, I don't. So this is interesting because it becomes a completely different experience, even though in theory it's the same thing. You're getting up and you're exercising, or you're doing what you're doing. So that's one of the advantages of having a bit of time go by as part of your practice, is considering it. So what's really helpful wherever possible with habit development is actually putting yourself in a few challenging situations at first, just to kind of get over the shock factor of it. Now, this isn't always possible, it's not always practical, but you can at least be a little bit forewarned, and that makes you a bit more resilient to it. If you set it up overly optimally in your mind and you go, okay, it's perfect, and then suddenly something happens that's outside of your expectations, it can be a bit hard to bounce back. But if you at least know what it is, at least you can visualize in advance, and you can say, okay, here's my habit. I'm going to give it a good period of time to make sure I get familiar with it. What are some of the things that might happen, that might be challenging, that might stand in my way? Okay, now, if that first one happens, how am I going to respond? And sometimes how you're going to respond is by just reaffirming your commitment. And just knowing that in advance sometimes is all that's needed. Other times you're going to respond by bringing in other supports. So maybe you need to get the heater on in the morning to make it feel a bit more comfortable. Or maybe you need to modify your goals according to the season. You know, it's not that farmers develop the habits of farming in an equal way at all times of the year. No, make hay while the sun shines. They develop different habits for different seasons based on what's realistic and what's practical. So you can do something like that as well. And it's not wrong for you to say, well, I'm going to really go for it in the summer, but maybe in the winter I'm going to have slightly different goals or expectations. Maybe that's not needed, maybe the opposite. But it's not wrong to think that. And something sustainable, I think, is really what we want here. We don't want something that seems on paper absolutely fabulous, but you know, it's actually not going to last beyond a few days because it doesn't really work. So there are some considerations, but I think the real thing to underscore here when it comes to habits is clarify what you want and practice it. Be a bit reflective. You know, start to notice some of those patterns that are already in play in your life, and then start to upgrade them a little bit, see how you could improve them, and look at ways of doing it that will work for you today as well as in the weeks and the months ahead so that they are sustainable. If you found this valuable, do like, subscribe, and share. And what's your experience? Do you have any questions or topic suggestions? You can contribute in the comments, on social media using hashtag bodymindself, or on jfl.com.